Honorable Governor of Telangana and Andhra Pradesh, Narasimhanji, Honorable Deputy Chief Minister of Telangana, Mahmood Ali Sahab, Vice Chancellor of Maulana Azad National Urdu University, Dr. Muhammad Aslam Parvez, distinguished guests, Khawateen wa Hazrat, आसमां बारे अमानत न तनावन खसी कुर्रे फाल बनामे मने दीवाना ज़दंद. I deem it a privilege to be asked to deliver the first Muhammad Quli Qutub Shah Memorial Lecture of the Maulana Azad National Urdu University. I thank the Vice Chancellor, Professor Aslam Parvez, for inviting me today. There could not have been a more appropriate venue. Muhammad Quli Qutub Shah was the founder of this city, designed to be a replica of the paradise itself. An early 17th century English traveler praised it for its sweetness of air, convenience of water, and fertility of soil, and ranked it higher than any in the realm of the Mughal emperor or other princes. One other reason should make the subject inseparable from this venue. Dakkani Urdu has its own pedigree and was the court language of Bijapur and Golconda kingdoms. Muhammad Quli Qutub Shah composed verses on his own admission every day, just like waves in a rippling in a river, and is credited as being the first person to have compiled a diwan. He was the first translator of Hafiz, and his efforts led to the birth of a Persian poetic style and usage in Dabistane, Golconda. History records that he was Epicurean by disposition with amorous propensities, and this is amply reflected in his poetry. A contemporary of Tulsidas, Mirabai, and Surdas, his poetry is bound to earth and revels in the universality of love and mystic experiences. It is intensely Indian and secular in its moods. The 17th century historian Muhammad Qasim Farishta depicted his temperament as forgiving and gentle. Work on the construction of Hyderabad commenced in the years 1590-91. One couplet of the founder of Hyderabad, which has already been recited by a previous speaker, expressed his wish for the new city. Mura शहर लोगा में मामूर कर रख्या जूतूर दरिया में मिन्या समय. Whatever be the veracity of the impulse leading to the building of the new city, a poet of our times did sum up the popular sentiment relating to it. शहर बाकी है, मोहब्बत का निशा बाकी है, तू नहीं है, तेरी चश्मे निगारा बाकी है. Hyderabadis, like ancient Athenians, look upon their city and fall in love with it. Much has been written about its charms. Professor Agha Haider Hassan Mirza's collection of essays Hyderabad ki Sair bears witness to it. So does Allama Ejaz Farooq's Hyderabad Shehr-e-Nigara. Sibte Hassan referred to it as the place where my consciousness became aware of the beauty of life and where I learned to love human beings. Narendra Luther has dwelt upon the history of the city. Vasant Bava on the last phase of the old order. And Saida Imam has put together 38 writings by admirers of different generations and in different walks of life. Friends, it is important to consider the context of the times and the place in history of the Qutb Shahi dynasty that lasted a mere 164 years from 1523 to 1687, when its last incumbent, Abul Hasan, surrendered to a Mughal general. In this short span, it witnessed a blossoming of architecture, poetry, music, art, dance, and cuisine, and became a byword for culture apart from being a vibrant center of international trade. An existential reality of the Indian landmass for 3 centuries in the medieval period of our history was the preponderance of a central power based in North India. Writing about the Mughal Emperor Akbar's approach to the Deccan, a biographer observed that, and I quote him, Akbar hovered like an eagle over the northern horizon and watched the fighting cocks of the southern states rending and wearing each other until his own time should come to prey on them. End of quote. As a result, in the words of another historian, the Deccan had no master narrative of its own, but it did have intense interaction with the peoples, cultures, and states of northern India, which did during our period become a sort of alter ego for societies south of the Narbada. Individuals, communities, and whole states defined their identity with respect to this colossus of the north, sometimes in opposition to it and sometimes in imitation of it. These independent or quasi-independent entities survived the imperial onslaught for varying periods by acknowledging some form of suzerainty. In the process, they developed their own style of governance. They detached religion from statecraft and culture from territorial boundaries, thereby giving themselves an enormously elastic and transnational character. Nor is the role of the mystics in forging ties between different segments of society to be ignored. This led to the eventual reconciliation of religions and culture. Two aspects of the statecraft of the Deccan states can be discerned and are worthy of mention. The first was the philosophy of governance and the necessity of a pragmatic approach towards the subjects of the state. The second pertained to the geopolitical considerations that confronted them in relation to the dominant power in the Indian subcontinent. The Qutb Shahis were of Iranian origin and had strong religious affiliations arising from their relationship with Iran particularly after the year 1501, when Shah Ismail resorted to strident sectarianism. Notwithstanding this, their approach to governance was pragmatic and secular. Writing about the administrative system in the reign of Ibrahim, father of Muhammad Quli Qutub Shah, the historian Harun Khan Sherwani has noted that very little differentiation was made between the Hindus and the Muslims as far as the affairs of the state were concerned. This was also so in the case of Muhammad Quli Qutub Shah's period, when a characteristic of the epoch was a spirit of camaraderie which existed between the Hindu and Muslim sections of the population, and the whole policy of the government seemed to have been that of equality of opportunity for both the Hindus and Muslims for practically all the officers of the state. His court, continues the historian, represented the culture of the Muslims and non-Muslims alike, and while he seemed prejudiced in his enunciation of the inferiority of the non-Shia sects of the Muslims, he is culturally at one with Hindus and the Parsis, as well as the man in the street, so far as his appreciation of their way of life is concerned. As a result, continues the historian, the whole outlook of the state was centered in the person of the Sultan, which was non-communal. Another aspect of this Catholicity of the approach was the Sultan's approach to Telugu language. His father, who spent 7 years as an honored guest in Vijayanagar, imbibed a passion for the language, and the same was the case with Muhammad Quli, to whom Telugu was like a mother tongue, and who used Telugu words in his Dakkani Urdu poems, offered patronage to its literary personages, and whose farbans and official announcements were bilingual. The Sultan thus made a deliberate attempt to synthesize cultures in the Deccan, imbibing in the people of Hyderabad a relish of tolerance, love of spectacle, and manliness of nature. I beg your pardon, mildness of nature. It is not altogether accidental that one of his successors became a patron of the Kuchipudi dance form. Muhammad Quli Qutub Shah occupies a place in our history, and his personality and contributions are studied with much benefit by anyone interested in the evolution of architecture, language, and culture. His policy of peace and diplomacy had warded off Mughal political influence as much as lay in his power, and his passing away on January 31, 1626, after a rule of 31 years, left the door open for Emperor Shah Jahan to pursue his program of subjugating the Deccan kingdoms. Ladies and gentlemen, in the vocabulary of statecraft, attempts at preponderance between political entities takes the shape of primacy, dominance, or hegemony. The principal feature of political geography of peninsular India in the 16th century was the primacy of the Vijayanagara Empire. And after the fall of the Bahmani kingdom, 5 small entities in the shape of Amarnagar, Bijapur, Bidar, Berar, and Golconda. This persisted till the Battle of Talikota in the year 1565, in which 4 of the northern entities combined and inflicted a crippling defeat on Vijayanagara. Another aspect of the region in that period was the quickening pace of its commercial and cultural interaction with the Iranian plateau that had the effect of drawing the whole of the Deccan into the orbit of Persian culture. This included sectarian affiliations and the mention of the Persian king in the Friday khutbah as a conscious act to demonstrate a degree of political affiliation. The regional state system of the Deccan also developed its own rules of interstate conduct, and in the face of Mughal incursions into Berar and Ahmednagar, regional frictions were put aside and Bijapur and Golconda stood like one in the face of invaders and forgot their quarrels. Thus, the Mughal designs on the Deccan entities and the latter's close affinity to Persia inevitably resulted in clash of interests and perceptions. A study of the bilateral relations in that period concluded that the distance between Persia and the Deccan and the fact that the former was not a naval power precluded the possibility of her providing material assistance to the latter, though a powerful ruler like Shah Abbas I could offer diplomatic support. The diplomatic relations between Persia and the Deccan kingdoms and the recitation of the Shah's name in the khutbah in Golconda were irritating to the Mughals, especially to a strong emperor like Shah Jahan. Equally objectionable would have been Shah Abbas II's attempt to incite the Deccan kings against the Mughal emperor during the War of Succession. Despite this, or on account of it, Mughal attempts at dominance persisted. Thus, in the reign of Shah Jahan, the Deccan entities were forced to sign inqiyad namas or deeds of submission. Their details make interesting reading. The document in the case of Golconda stipulated acceptance to be designated as hereditary disciples of the Mughal emperor and to undertake the following. 1. Replace the name of the 12 Imams and of the Shah of Persia and replace them with those of the 4 Caliphs and the Mughal emperor. 2. The gold and silver coins to be stuck with the formula passed by the Mughal emperor. 3. Specified amounts of annual tributes to be sent. 4. Consider the emperor's friends as friends and his enemies as enemies. 5. Swear on the Quran that he would abide by each of these commitments and that if he were to stray from the right path, then the emperor would be justified in ordering his servants to conquer his kingdom. And 6. If a neighbor committed aggression and occupied Golconda territory, necessary assistance would be provided and the loss compensated. The formal transition from Sultan to hereditary disciple thus made clear the vassal status. Despite this, the wider diplomatic game between the Safavids in Persia and the Mughals of seeking and restricting influence continued. So did the device of equipping Iranian traders coming to Golconda with letters from the Shah to the local ruler. It was strongly objected to by the Mughal court. Similarly, efforts at cultivating local influence through court officials of Iranian descent were made by the Iranian rulers. The most famous amongst the latter was the rich and resourceful diamond merchant Muhammad Said, better known by his official title of Mir Jumla, who was in correspondence with Shah Abbas II. This brought Mughal retribution to the city of Hyderabad and in return propelled Abdullah Qutub Shah to make a desperate appeal to the Shah to deploy some Persian contingents on the Mughal frontier and offered to pay the expenses of the expedition. Similarly, in the war of succession after Shah Jahan's death, there was clear evidence of Safavid intervention on the side of Dara Shikoh. In a counter move, Aurangzeb contemplated but did not pursue an invasion of Persia in alliance with the Uzbeks. In the meantime, the final incorporation into the empire of Golconda and other Deccan entities and a succession of weak successors to Shah Abbas II in Persia did away with the necessity of diplomatic and military pressures emanating from Delhi. In the final analysis, the Mughal Empire was able to beat off the threat and prevail. It is a different matter that effective dominance did not last very long, since by the beginning of the 18th century, signs of weakness and eventual disintegration were visible. In 1713, Aurangzeb's successor, Farrukhsiyar, appointed Asif Jah as the Viceroy of Deccan. The latter realized his limitations and never claimed to be king. His successors in the dynasty followed this practice. To a historian or a student of geopolitics, the power of equation of the Mughals and the Qutub Shahis on the one hand and the Mughals and the Safavids on the other sheds interesting light on the rules of the game of political chess that have an abiding quality and transcend limitations of time and geography. Equally evident is the persisting nature of the instrumentalities, namely threat or use of force, interference on pretext of faith, use and misuse of trade and traders, and attempts to seek fifth columns based on affinities of race or origin, and these were used to further policy objectives. Another set of historians, even normal citizens, would search for the perennial rather than the transitory in the legacy of Muhammad Quli Qutub Shah and his successors, and perhaps raise two questions. One, what kind of political and socio-economic culture did the successor states of Hyderabad inherit? And two, was there anything of value left by the state of Hyderabad, and can it still contribute to the Indian polity? Contemporary Hyderabad, as this audience knows very well, has crafted with skill and success a place for itself in the new world of the 21st century. One can only hope that its inherited tradition of tolerance, coexistence, inclusiveness, and cultural effervescence would continue to signal its uniqueness and remain an example for the country. हमको मिटा सके ये ज़माने में दम नहीं, हमसे ज़माना खुद है, ज़माने से हम नहीं। जय हिंद।